Yeah, we're live. We are there. But that's just another place. I can edit all that. Yes, sir.
Okay. Pressing play.
Press play. Record, not play. Record. Okay. And we can edit all this, so
Yep.
you're good. Should we pray for this thing? Nah, it's okay.
Okay.
You're good. I gotta like ease into it.
No, I'm just trying to get the full mugs in there.
Line up. Hey guys, thanks for joining us. This is just the conversation that we're going to have with Professor Fred Blackburn and myself, Professor Usita. We teach at San Diego Christian College, and Fred, give us a quick introduction of how long you've been here and what you do here at the college.
I taught my first class here in 1991 and have been teaching since then. I'm the philosophy and religions teacher. And so this will be an interesting dialogue, kind of a cross-discipline dialogue, but I'll be mostly coming from a philosophical and religious perspective.
And I have been teaching here this is my 9th year, and I teach in the Biblical Studies department. I tend to teach the practical ministries, youth ministries, pastoral ministries courses. And my interest in identity is that I studied identity. My dissertation was adolescent identity formation in online space. And so I wanted to study how an adolescent's identity was formed because they spend so much time online. So I'm coming from a more psychological, sociological perspective. And I'm not just studying identity, I really wanted to focus in on how identity is formed. So this will be a fun conversation. And we've been talking about identity for, well, since I started teaching here. And so this will be a fun conversation for us to just, record our conversation on identity. So if you can, why don't you go first and you give us just a philosophical perspective on identity. Like how does the philosopher see identity? Because when I was studying it, I noticed obviously the sociologists they were taking it from that sociological perspective. Psychologists were taking it from that personal perspective. How does a philosopher see identity?
I'll give you a quick philosophical and religious sampler.
Okay.
And because they kind of break down into broad categories. In philosophy, ever since the ancient Greeks with Plato and Aristotle, we had two major movements in thought. Idealism, the idea that ideas are the most real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that the physical world isn't real, but it's transitory. Everything physical you see will one day pass away or change into something else.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the intangibles that remain, that abide, that are eternal. And in this sense, Plato had a very eternal idea of the soul or the self.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this idealistic view, it's not that your body isn't real or doesn't matter, but it is like a shadow of your ultimate reality, the idea of you. Aristotle was the father of realism, or I prefer to call it physicalism, where he believed in both a physical and a non-physical world as well, but he starts with the physical material. So his emphasis would start with the physical form,
The body.
and then he would reason and think about it from that place. And that has really taken off in our modern society, with especially Aristotle himself wasn't a materialist, but he had strong materialist leanings. Philosophically speaking, a materialist is someone who believes that only matter exists or is real. It's very similar to naturalism, this idea that all phenomena, including our idea of the self, anything we can perceive,
Mm-hmm.
has a natural explanation. You don't need gods or angels or spirits, things that you can't perceive with the senses. And so that's where you see a lot of neuroscience going, and philosophy is also engaged in the study of the self.
Mm-hmm.
And do we have a non-material self, or can we really break down the self simply to neurons and synapses and chemical reactions, and we're just a composite of all these firings going on in our brain?
Mm-hmm.
This kind of ties into a Buddhist view In a Buddhist view of identity or self, the ultimate goal is the annihilation of the self, because they believe it's a false ego self, and it separates you from the true nature of reality, which is one. Everything is one, and you are that one, or part of that one. But you have no individual self. That's tying you into the illusion of this world. Hinduism believes your ultimate self is God. When you peel back all the layers and you see your identity within, that identity itself is God. And so it's really interesting looking at these different views: idealism, materialism, Buddhism, Hinduism. And then Christianity, we're going to be focusing more on that realm of like, what's a Christian identity of self? What does that mean? And that goes all the way back to the Psalms, where all the way back to Genesis, where it talks about God creating man out of the dust of the earth. So there is a physical component of being a human in biblical terms. But the kicker is, and God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So it was a non-material thing that actually made man a living being. And so that's where my focus is more on, when I talk about what does it mean to be human, or a human being as opposed to a plant being or an animal being or angelic being, what are those unique traits? And this is one of my pressing questions I think about every day. That it's a $1 million question. Who are you? When you think about I, me, mine, what is it that you're thinking about? Are you thinking about your body, or are you thinking about some intangible, some non-material aspect of your being?
Thank you for that.
You're
That's
welcome.
fantastic. When I did my research on identity, as I'm listening to you, I started more with the psychological perspective on it, a very humanistic perspective, right? Just taking a look at development. But I needed some kind of theoretical framework wherein to start the conversation about identity. And so psychology worked out, like the psychological perspective worked out for me. And it's really interesting as you're going through your perspective on it, like we never talked about the soul. There was no conversation. I mean, we would ask a question about who we are and who are you, and then how do you define, or how do you quantify that? How do you manipulate that? How does that all change? And so there's different perspectives, and sometimes the self. There was lots of conversations about the self, but not really about the soul. That was kind of like, as I would read things that. People would say, yeah, that's the work of philosophers to figure out the soul. We just want to have that conversation about the self. And so the way that I looked at identity, really just centered around self, right? The self that is happening here, that's real, the self that I project, the self that you interact with, the professor self, the friend self, like all these different like projections of myself. That's the way that we looked at it. That's the way that I wanted to study it, because there's a self that exists, this embodied self that exists online, and I wanted to study, like, how does that online interaction shape, the one sitting in front of the computer screen. I just want that's what I wanted to study. So that's why I was looking at identity as a theoretical framework to look at that kind of interaction. And so we never asked questions about synapses or soul or and anything. Yeah, and anything like it was very intangible, because identity is this thing that we all have, right? And it's this thing that we all understand and we all know, but we all describe it differently depending on our perspective. And so for the way that I studied it, it was just taking a look at selves and the projection of that self. And so it wasn't necessarily tied into a body necessarily, because I can project a version of myself online. I could also do that in front of my class, or in front of my friends, or in front of a church. So I think I just took a look at identity projections more than anything. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I guess it raises a lot of questions for me in my mind. Is
perfect. This is the conversation.
That identity of self, And, you know, I threw out the word soul there, but that's a super loaded word. And so I just want,
And that's probably
to
why
define-
that's why probably why I didn't read about it much,
Sure.
because like, let the philosophers do that. Really, that's the perspective.
there's a debate between whether or not we even have a soul. You know, a materialist or a lot of neuroscientists would say, no, you don't have a soul. You're a biochemical, you know,
Massive,
machine basically.
right?
And it does certain things based on certain stimuli or genetic predispositions or, you know, firings. But that's very different from like a theistic perspective of the soul or this idealistic perspective. And the soul really would be what we would identify as the self. And this idea of it would be everything like your will, even like different aspects. There's different aspects of the soul. The highest functioning part we call it the nous in Greek. And this is how you can think of first principles, like right and wrong, good and evil. You can make value judgments. You can think of concepts beyond your experience, like perfection or eternity, or these are things that none of us have experienced physically. So it
It's
raises
all in
the
your
question,
consciousness.
where does that come from? How do we get this knowledge which is beyond human experience or understanding? But I mean, you can talk to people and we know what we're talking about when we talk about perfection. And that's a curious thing. And when we say like, oh, you know, that's an ugly house or that horse is deformed, it's because we have already a template or an idea of what a perfect horse or house or something should look like. So, but it's not just the nous, these abstract first principles, which I think might be one of the unique things that separates us from all other types of life, is these principles. We also have like this logos, or this ability to reason and to do analytic judgments and to look at patterns and categories and to order the world. And then we have the cardia, or the heart, the seat of emotion and passions. And so the soul is like a composite or made up of these different types of knowing things, first principles, reasoning, and emotion. And some people are more emotive, some people are more rational.
Right.
And then coupled with that, we all have different temperaments and personalities.
Right.
And that is going to be a huge part of how you see yourself or identify yourself.
Right.
Whether you're a natural born leader, like a choleric, hard driving, take charge person, whether you're laid back, phlegmatic, easygoing, cool, whether you're sanguine, very emotive, you wear your emotions on your sleeve, or whether you're a dark, brooding, creative, melancholy type.
Sure.
That's all part of tied into how we see ourselves.
Right.
So when we say I, me, mine, or we make a conscious choice of the will, that's what I'm talking about, soul life.
Okay.
So my question for you is, when you talk about different projections of the self, and you also, I think, implied something about knowing ourselves. Is that part of it? See, that goes all the way back to Socrates.
No,
Right?
absolutely.
The unexamined life is not worth living, or know thyself.
Right.
Because
So as
if you don't do that,
So as you talk about that, like the concept that I was working with was a William James concept, you know, father psychology from years ago, and he said that there was the I, you know, the knower, right, and that's your true self or your real self, right, where all of those things that you talk about come from. But then we create all these me's, these created, projected me's out into the world, right, and we interact with different people in different settings with a different projected me. And the me cannot know the I, right?
the me can't know the I.
The me can't know the I because the I is the knower. This is the true real self right here. But I put out a projection of me out here. And then there's this concept of the dialogical self where these me projections can be in, they can agree or they can even disagree. And there's something natural and normal about that, right? So this projected me and this projected me can be in seeming contradiction or even just straight out contradiction. But those are versions of me that I'm playing out. Because the idea is as I mature and as I grow and as I become more perfect, right? That those projections of me come closer and closer to the true version of me. But But in psychology, like the psychological perspective is, you have to actually try out those me's in order to hit an identity crisis and realize, oh, this is not me, right?
So that would be part of the adolescent angst.
Part of the
struggle of
sure, part of
more.
Yeah, part of the adolescent angst. It's just identity exploration. That's what they call it, right? So as you explore your identity, you start making commitments to these me's that are actually a part of I, or a part of you, right? And so that's really what I was looking at, more so the process of becoming more I.
But it would be so easy in doing that experimentation to somehow get sucked into like a false self.
But the false self still comes from I.
But you could be living a life that is not being true to who you are.
Absolutely.
And it seems to me that many people do that.
So the way that I would explain that is, you have real self here, and you have a projected me here, or the way that you put it is false self. So from my concept, even a false self still comes from a very true place. And so you can either live from this point, this real version of you, or you can live out in this projection. So that's what you're talking about. When you live out the reality of this false self, or this projected me out here, you're not living in true self. You're living in that projected version. And some people, to be honest with you, there's this other concept called the reflected self, right? And so I project a version of me out here, and this version of me interacts with people out there. And as people affirm my projected self, it shapes true self. Does that make sense? And so if I'm living out this false self and people keep affirming, hey, this is you, this is you, this is you, it starts to shape my true sense of self, right? And so then I start believing what other people are affirming in me, and it affirms my false self, and that in turn then shapes my real self, right? And then I start becoming that false self, which in my concept is still real self.
It sounds awful.
But it sounds awful, but that same principle also works in affirming your true self. Does that make sense? Because if someone's playing out their false self, I can come alongside of them and say, this is not you. And my words also shape them, and I can shape their true self as I interact with that projected version of themselves.
So you think your true self can change?
My true self, I'm using true self. I don't think I'm using true self like you would understand true self. But my real self or my true self can definitely be impacted by the words and phrases that other people affirm to me.
Maybe we do have a disagreement here, because my goal and with my students is to try to get them to know who they really are, their true identity.
Right.
Because that becomes the core of their being from which everything else flows. And I literally try to help them stop projecting false selves or to be different selves. And I'm not saying I don't interact with children differently than I interact with teenagers, and I interact with my students, and I interact with people in authority over me.
Yes.
But I'm not changing myself to do that.
Okay, this is how I would respond to that. Your true self stays true, but when my projected version of me gets affirmed, then I live out here. Does that make sense? So then my true self my true self doesn't change. I just live out in this false self, this projected version of myself.
But why would you want to do that? Why wouldn't you want to show people your true self?
There's all kinds of reasons for why I wouldn't want to do that. But the reflective self says, when this projected version of myself gets affirmed, when it gets affirmed by like, hey, this is you, and I like this version of you.
But it's like a mask.
It absolutely is a mask.
And I guess my goal is to peel back the mask until
only
absolutely
the
real remains.
Absolutely. That's my goal as well.
I'm not a Buddhist, but
No,
that's
no,
a Buddhist technique. It's removing these false, it's like roles we have in life. I have lots of roles, but that's not myself.
No, absolutely. But again, that's why I say projected version of yourself. But some people live in the projected version of themselves and not in their real selves. And so like I was saying, like as you explore and as you hit these identity crises, you mature and your projected self actually moves closer to your true self. So that like you get to this point where like no matter what setting you're in, I'm getting the true version of you. Like I've interacted with people in that way. So I'm just describing the process and how I see it. So I think we agree more than disagree. So I would love for people to live in their true selves,
Yes.
but you have to process through your projected versions of yourself.
Yeah, I think that's part of a journey of life.
Right, that's part of growth and development and maturity. And like I love that you said, I love that you brought up perfection, because perfection was a huge concept for me. Like when I was studying identity, and the Greek word is teleos, perfection, complete maturity, lacking nothing, right? And so, like our concept of it is, our concept of it is perfect is the static. I need to get to this place, but the concept in the scriptures is that it's possible to become teleos and then to become even more so, you know, so that we're becoming even more perfect, you know. So it's possible to hit perfect and then it become even more. I love that concept way better than the static, like, oh, I hope to hit perfection on a day. Like we can hit perfect, we can get to our true selves, right? And I'll work on the scriptures later.
Okay. It's an odd use of the word perfect, but I don't want to squabble over details.
That's fine.
I think.
Wait, how does formation then happen? How does identity formation happen? In
Well,
your
I
concept.
agree with what you're saying. I mean, especially when people are young, like many of our students or high school. I
This
think
is
a lot of it
late
starts,
adolescence right here.
right. It probably starts in junior high for most people, because it's almost like there's a blackout years for children. You know, they're just kind of almost like little creatures just experiencing the world directly, and
Right.
there's not a lot of self-reflective thought. But then there begins this process where you begin to want, you know, it's not just about the approval of others anymore. It's also like there's an internal compass you're trying to.
A generativity.
Right. There's a part of you that you begin to say, you know, like these people are making me feel uncomfortable, or I'm engaged in activities or ways of thinking with this group of people that, I don't know, it seems to be like violating a core principle of myself. And these people seem to be like ennobling and enriching my idea of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And these people are confirming and these people are degrading. And that's part of it. And people get stuck in different groups.
Right.
And it's horrific to see.
Well, and they get stuck in different explorations of their identity. Right. And so there's some roads that lead you to some dark places.
And people,
but from the psychological perspective, that's still helpful, and it's still natural, and it's still normal. And so, but that's why we need people to come along and help mentor and guide the exploration.
I mean, I guess it's helpful in the sense that it's part of the process, as long as it stays part of the process.
Right.
When people confuse that, like you probably have friends that are like fanatical sports fans, and their whole identity is tied up in like a sports team. The rooms are like shrines. They're always wearing their team colors. They know all the stats, and it's just like they've somehow made that like their identity.
Right.
And it's just like, really? I mean, is that really? It's not just something they enjoy or a hobby or a pastime. They literally, their well-being rises or falls with the fortunes of a team.
Right.
Other people do it with politics.
Right,
or,
but that's the kind of identity that's wrapped in a community, right? These are my people.
right.
I am a part of this, you know, Packer tribe, Charger tribe. You know what I mean? They find their identity in that community. That's what you're saying, right?
Sure, or it could be in being a Republican or a Democrat.
Absolutely.
Or it could be in a location, right? I'm a Southern Californian, or I'm a Texan, and you know, I wore my little California Pride shirt today and all that. But I mean, there can be a lot of identity tied in with even like your place.
Right.
or with
Because
your
it defines
religion, right?
you.
Like
It
I'm a
defines you. It
Christian, or
defines the way that you think.
I'm
It
a
defines
Muslim, or I'm a Buddhist.
your thought process.
Right?
Fantastic.
But even with those titles, even the title like I'm a Christian, I mean, what are you talking about? I mean, is that like a set of norms or values or shared goals?
Sometimes,
Or is
sometimes it is.
Does it mean
Sometimes
something deeper?
sometimes it's my denomination, you know. But then, like I said, like as you mature, those things change, right? So at one point, in immaturity, it's rules, it's a group to identify with. But then, hopefully, as you grow and as you mature, as you become more perfect, right? It changes. Those things change, right? Because you change. But I don't think your true identity, your true self changes, right? Because that's something that God gives you. Tell me about that, like your perspective on that, because we've talked about that. So going back to the true self.
The true self?
Yes. So we have all of these trappings, we have all of these projections, we have all of these things out here. So when you're a child and when you're an adolescent, you identify or you project a certain kind of identity because of your development. But as you grow and as you mature and as you become more yourself, right? You hopefully those things mature as well. I mean, and talk to me about that. Like, tell me how do we become our true selves? Because that, I mean, that's something that you want to help people with.
Right. Well, from my belief system,
Perfect.
I believe the great tragedy of the human condition is we're all born in a state of a false self. And we can never be authentic or true to ourselves because we are born in Adam.
Right.
And in Adam, we're literally born dead or disconnected from what we were intended to be.
And then when you're born again, what happens to your true identity?
For the first time in your life,
yes,
you are able to be an authentic and true self when you are in Christ.
So you do not have true self until you're born again.
That is my firm belief.
Me too.
And my experiential knowledge in my life.
That's fantastic.
And it's also, we find that in scriptures too, Christ says the most bizarre and confusing things in the Gospels about he who seeks his life will lose it, but he who loses his life for my sake will find it.
Yeah.
It's a life eternal. And that sounds so nonsensical. How can I find myself by losing myself? But it's even more than losing yourself. It's literally
dying to yourself.
So.
That you need to die daily, take up his cross and follow him.
And that takes us to like Romans 6, talking about it's not only that Jesus died for us, but we were crucified with him.
Mm-hmm.
And it is in death, he says, those who have died are free from sin. And Jesus talked about whoever you serve, that is your master.
Right.
And until we die to self, we are under the law, under the curse of the law, and we are under the power of sin.
Right.
When we have died, it's not that the law has died, we have died, and in dying, we are free from the law.
And in dying, we become alive. For me to live is Christ,
Right.
and to die is gain. And then I think about, Galatians 2:20. I'm crucified with Christ.
Right. So
Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ who lives in me. So that's true self. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me.
it's like Jesus' talk with Nicodemus. He explained to him, you must be born again. And that becomes such a Christian cliche, but it's not. It literally is, you are being born into your true, authentic self for the first time in your life.
Right.
And I'm not saying there won't be residuals of what you were talking about.
Right, because we're still living here in this world, in this culture.
And you may still identify as a Charger fan, or a Raider fan, or as a Californian, or as a Texan. But you begin to see that those things begin to fade. And that's not who your true identity is.
Right.
That's not where your hopes, your joy, your accomplishments, that's not where they lie. Because now your identity has changed to something.
Is in Christ.
It's in Christ.
So as your identity, as you're born again and you find your identity in Christ, you're able to become more yourself.
Yeah, for the first time ever.
Yeah, can you share that story when you were introduced? Because that's perfect.
Right. Well, as a lead up, when I first came to this school, one of the older teachers kind of took me under his wing, was kind of like my protector, mentor, really helped bring me along. And he would admonish me, it seemed like weekly, that I really needed to tone down being so eccentric and having so many little foibles.
Right.
That it could.
Which are identity projections.
Right. Basically, all I was hearing was stop being yourself.
Well, but those aren't really yourself. Those are just projections of yourself, not your full self.
It's not my full self, but it was the way I would give the world little glimpses of who I was.
Okay, and sometimes that's all we see,
Sure.
and so we see those things and we think that you're all like that. But
Right.
we need to understand that those are just projections, not complete versions of ourselves. Okay, keep going. I like that.
And part of it was I also had a lot of shields up because I felt I had been so disabused in the past when I shared my true self, or as much as I knew of my true self with other people.
See, those are the things that get affirmed.
Right. And when those things were rejected, I began to put up shields to actually make it more difficult for people to get to know me.
Which those shields are also identity projections.
Maybe. But it wasn't like to let.
See, because that's what your shield, the shield you put up is like, hey, this is what I want to represent me.
But it was an opposite. I wanted people to have to go through a workout, like they had to earn the right to get to know me.
And then so when and that would like weed out people, huh?
That I probably didn't want to know.
Because people would see that and be like, well, I don't want to.
I mean, this is like a great example. This beard hair. It's like
identity projection.
An identity shield. And if you want to know me, you have to get past my beard.
Okay.
But see, a lot of people do that in different ways. You see that with like punk rockers were notoriously famous for that, with all their piercings and spiked hair, and you see that with people with extreme tattoos or projections.
Right. Those are all projections.
But when I see people like that, instead of being off-put, I see it as like, I dare you to get to know me. Right. I dare you to get past my shield.
Right.
And I love it. Yeah. It's like challenge accepted. Show me who you really are.
Fantastic.
Not this form.
And I want you to. That's everybody. That's not just you. It's me. It's everybody out here. And anyone listening to this, we all have that.
Anyways, so I'm being admonished on a weekly basis to stop having these little eccentric shields or foibles or whatever you want to call them. But all I was hearing was stop being yourself or people won't accept you. You'll be off-putting. And the most curious thing happened to me last year. I've been teaching, Lim teaches there too, it's called the Joshua Wilderness Institute. Shout out to Joshua Wilderness at Hume Lake.
JWI.
And when I was introduced last year, one of the directors introduced me as Fred Blackburn, which is my name. But she started to say the most bizarre things. And she said, this isn't just Fred Blackburn, this is Jesus Fred. That's how he identifies himself. And that's, if you ask me who I was, without any shields, any veils, that's how I would answer. I'm Jesus Fred. I'm not claiming to be Jesus, but I am so knit together with Christ when I'm walking in the Spirit, I can't separate my identity from being knit together with Jesus. That is the true core of my being. But what she began to say was, as Fred has yielded his life to Jesus, Jesus has made Fred the most authentic and true Fred that Fred could possibly be. And Fred is now more Fred than he ever was when he was just trying to be Fred on his own. And I had to think about that for a while.
Before you had to speak.
I never heard anyone talk like that. And the more I thought about it, I realized it was so true. I didn't, in dying to myself, it's not like Fred disappeared. This isn't Buddhist annihilation of the self or ego. It's a new self. It's a new creation knit together with
It's the
Christ.
forming of your true self.
Right. The Fred Jesus always intended me to be.
How would it have been if these mentors would have been a little bit more supportive and open with you? How do you think that would have? I know you can't really answer that.
Well, they were supportive in their own ways, and you can only do what you can do. But see, these weren't just projections for me. Was part of who I was, like passions, hopes, desires.
Right, but then if you don't see, this is what we don't tend to create that safe space in our Christian settings to explore some of those things. And in exploring, when you explore on your own, you hit those identity crises on your own, and you get to that point where you're like, that's really not me. This is more me. Like we don't really have those. We haven't really created those spaces conducive for exploring some of our identities. We tell students, we tell students in our youth ministries, don't think like this, dress like this, and that stunts.
I don't.
Well, and maybe this is churches that I go to, or the ones that I've been a part of. Like, but you were saying, like, you had mentors in your life saying, stop this identity exploration. But if we create spaces for our young people who need this kind of mentoring to explore in this, context of love, they get to it quicker, right? Because that's a natural process of things. They're going to explore this thing. Let's walk alongside them.
That's my hope.
Right, and that's what we get to do
That's
here.
my classroom setting.
Right,
It's
that's what
exactly
we get
trying
to do
get
that.
people to, like, it's okay to think differently.
Right.
And it's okay to ask questions, and even if it seems out of the norm of the community, and let's explore that together.
Right.
Let's talk about that. I mean,
Because
but-
that helps form identity. That helps you to get to your true self.
But I call it hedges. What often happens in institutions, whether that's companies or churches or families, is we tend to put hedges around certain issues. And the idea of a hedge is kind of like, say you have some sort of clear prohibition from Scripture, like avoid all sexual immorality.
Mhm.
So in order to avoid sexual immorality, we might put a hedge out here saying, well,
Sure,
if you're dating,
yes,
don't go past third base,
Sure.
or don't have full sexual intercourse. And someone else might say, well, maybe we should back up the hedge to where no heavy petting
Sure.
unless you're engaged or married or something like that.
Sure.
And then maybe someone else will say, how about no touching,
Yeah.
or no kissing, or no looking,
Yeah.
and so you get these hedges, and the intention of hedges is out of love and concern, because you don't want people to fall into sin or pick up
And
bad
some of
habits.
them are good. Hedges. You're not saying hedges are bad. They're good.
Self-imposed hedges, I think, can be of great value, especially if you have certain besetting sins.
Right.
Like, if you have a problem with pornography, you probably want to be careful, your web browser settings, or
Right.
where you have your computer,
Right.
or those are, and so I'm not saying that. If you have a problem with drunkenness, perhaps you shouldn't be hanging out at bars or
Mhm.
clubs or things like that. I mean, that would be a good hedge for you.
Mhm.
The problem is we begin to project our personal hedges onto other people,
Right.
and we tend to judge them or value them based on how well they're living up to our hedges or our ideas or standards.
Right.
But where are we going with this?
No, formation of identity and
Oh, exploration. The reason a lot of places like our school or certain churches or places is not comfortable with that exploration, because, I mean, what does that mean? Like, think of sexual identity. I mean, how far do you want people in your care to explore their sexual identity? I mean, what if someone has homosexual attractions or same-sex attractions? Or what if someone feels at the core of themselves they're transgender, or they have gender dysphoria? They feel like they're the wrong gender inside from
Right,
what their
but-
physical body is.
But see, and I have this conversation with students all the time, and I say, explore that, and they automatically go to doing that. But that's not what I'm saying. Exploration let's just talk about it. That's exploring. talking about your feelings and talking about like what you think about these things and taking a look at scripture. I mean, when I say explore it, I'm not saying go do it. There are ways to explore identity, our identity projections without doing it, without jumping into it. Like, so you can read about it, you can have these conversations, you can ask these questions. So I'm not saying we have to go out and do it, but sometimes we don't even have a space conducive for having that kind of dialogue.
Oh, right. You're not allowed to ask certain questions.
Yeah.
Or talk about.
Yeah, that's what so I'm not saying go out and do it. Like, it's not even safe to like explore the dialogue or to ask the questions. And identity formation, the process is such that like we need this kind of exploration in order to grow, in order to hit those identity crises. And so I would encourage that kind of conversation, that kind of exploration, that kind of dialogue to help someone process through that. So I'm not saying go out and do it.
So you're still okay with these like hedges or boundaries or rules?
No, children need them.
Sure.
Adolescents need them. I need them. I'm not saying that but within these hedges, we can still explore within. I said in my it's. I'm not gonna say what I said in my class, but we can explore and we can have that dialogue within these hedges. Absolutely, we need those.
But see, even with all that exploration, these are all still for me like peripherals of my true core self. I mean, like
but peripherals, like in my concept, are still my identity projections that are connected to me. They all come from here.
Sure.
So they all come from a real place. No matter how peripheral my idea is, it starts here. Out of the goodness that a man stores in his heart comes out good things, and out of the evil that a man stores in his heart.
Yes, I agree.
And out of the abundance of the heart, I put out way in the peripheral, but it still represents me.
I'm talking more about like quirks or tastes or preferences or those sorts of things.
Which are identity markers.
Yeah, but I see them more like bangles or accessories as opposed to core value, core self.
But you still put them on.
Sure, I wear them daily.
Right, right. Do you see what I'm saying? So even though they're peripheral, you haven't shaved your beard. I mean, like, it's still
for whatever reason I had to shave my beard, I would not lose myself. Is what I'm saying.
Yes, I agree with you. But you have your beard still.
Right. And I enjoy my beard. And it brings me great joy. But I am not my beard.
I know.
I'm not my body.
No, and that's what I was saying. Like, our projected versions of us, they're not us. But we're still projecting them, I chose to wear this kind of shirt and buy this kind of shirt because this is what I want to represent me.
But let's take it back.
And those things aren't me. They're just projections.
Let's take it back to true identity. Ultimately, where I want to be is that all my projections aren't bangles and accessories, but it's people see past all of that stuff and they see the true core of my being, which is Jesus. That's all I want people to see.
Yes, absolutely. I'm with you.
But
I'm with you. And
Fred's still there.
Yeah, no.
It's Jesus Fred or Fred Jesus. But that's who I want them to see.
Right.
And
I'm with you, but we need to teach people how to see that.
Because people have to live that for one thing.
Absolutely, but that's what we teach. We teach people how to see Jesus Fred. We teach people how to see like the true self, because and that's why we're making this differentiation between the projected ones and the peripheral ones. Because a lot of people, and you shared the story, will see the projected version of you and think that's all you, and think that that's really what's happening.
Oh, right, which is very sad.
That's why we have to teach the difference, right? And that's why we're having this conversation.
And part of what Liv's saying about is, a lot of people see you like teach or give a seminar or you're on stage, and for some reason they think that is who you are. And like what I'm saying, that's part of who you are.
Part of who you are.
But if those people who thought that's how I was 24, like how I teach in the classroom was how I was at home, they would be sorely disappointed.
Right.
Because at home, I am just super introspective.
See, you play a role. The Professor Fred shows up, and that's what you play. But it's not completely you, but it's still you.
it's something I do, but it's not who I am.
Yes,
But who I
absolutely.
am can do that.
If
Would be the
and
distinction.
and I think part of what we get to do here is walk along students and help them to know the difference between their identity projections and their true self, their Jesus self, right? That's what we get to do here. If just give me one scripture to like tie all your ideas together, if you could.
I've really been obsessing on this idea of union with Christ.
Yeah.
And so like in
Not a
I
bad thing to
think
obsess
it's
about.
1 Corinthians 6:17, I believe, it talks about, he's talking about why we shouldn't join ourselves to prostitutes or harlots, because he says, know you not that he who is joined to a harlot becomes one flesh. But then in the very next verse, right after he gives you that really graphic sexual imagery,
Mhm.
he says, but you are united or joined with Christ.
Mhm.
And if you be joined with Christ, you are one spirit with him. So just like in physical sexual relationships, you become one flesh with someone, we have that kind of spiritual intimacy with Jesus where the two become one spirit. And it doesn't mean we cease to exist or annihilation of ourselves, but we are so united with him that there comes a point where we don't know where the one ends and the other begins.
Did you say 1 Corinthians or 2nd?
1 Corinthians 6:17, I believe.
Fantastic. When you said that, it reminded me of 2 Corinthians 4. You know, where in the beginning, it talks about how, like we hold in these jars of clay the glory of God.
Yes.
And then this is one of the verses that I use in my research. 2 Corinthians 4:16 says, "Therefore we do not lose heart, though outwardly we're wasting away. Inwardly we're being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us the struggle, right? The suffering. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." So we have that. That's our true self.
Yes.
So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. And since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And I think that's what we get to do here. So thanks for joining us, you guys. We'll continue the conversation maybe. And if you have any questions, you can email us. You can email Fred can you email Fred? What's your email?
Just fblackburn@sdcc.edu.
And you can email me at lusita@sdcc.edu or hit me up on Twitter @Lumness. Thanks for joining us, you guys. Thanks, Fred.
Thanks, Lynn. Jesus, Lynn.
Holy cow. Oh, what do you think?
It's good. Sometimes I